The jungle was alive with sound. Birds called out from the treetops, insects buzzed in the thick air, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at animals moving just out of sight. Deep within this dense, untamed wilderness, Michael Harper, a 32-year-old wildlife photographer, sat quietly on a fallen log. His camera hung around his neck, unused as he scanned the trees for movement. He had come to the Congo to document the elusive mountain gorillas, an ambitious project that had been his dream since he was a boy. But after weeks in the jungle, battling humidity, exhaustion, and the constant hum of insects, Michael hadn't gotten the shot he'd hoped for. Mountain gorillas were shy, avoiding humans whenever possible. The few times he'd caught a glimpse, they were already disappearing into the thick greenery, leaving him with nothing but blurry photos and frustration. Then came the fateful day. It began with a mistake. Michael had wandered farther from his camp than he should have, his focus entirely on the trail of crushed vegetation that indicated a gorilla troop had passed through recently. The excitement of finally getting close clouded his judgment. Hours passed, and before he realized it, the jungle around him began to darken. The familiar sounds of camp were long gone, replaced by the eerie, low hum of the wilderness at dusk. The jungle was closing in around Michael, and with each passing moment, his panic deepened. He tried to calm himself, to focus on retracing his steps, but the reality of his situation was impossible to ignore. The sun was gone now, swallowed by the thick canopy overhead, leaving him in near total darkness. The shadows of the jungle stretched endlessly in every direction, each tree looking identical to the last. His breathing grew shallow as he stumbled over roots and vines, his boots crunching on the forest floor. The familiar hum of daytime creatures had been replaced by the eerie symphony of the night. Somewhere in the distance, the mournful cry of a bird echoed, followed by the sudden rustling of leaves nearby. Michael froze, his heart pounding. Something was out there, watching him. He clutched the straps of his camera bag as if it were a lifeline, forcing himself to keep moving. But no matter which direction he turned, the jungle seemed endless, a labyrinth of towering trees and thick underbrush. There was no signal on his GPS, no bearings to guide him. He had underestimated how quickly the jungle could turn on someone who wasn't paying attention. Every instinct told him he needed to find shelter for the night, but where? There was no clearing, no high ground, no safe place to escape the predators that hunted in the dark. The sounds of the jungle began to grow louder, more menacing. A distant roar pierced the night. A leopard, he realized, the apex predator of this land. His skin crawled as he imagined the powerful cat stalking him, its golden eyes glinting in the shadows. "Keep moving," he whispered to himself, though his legs felt like lead. The weight of his exhaustion pressed on him, but fear was an even heavier burden. The jungle seemed alive with movement. The creak of branches above, the rustling of leaves around him, the occasional snapping of twigs underfoot. Every sound made him jump, his imagination conjuring predators that weren't even there. Then he heard it. A sound unlike anything else he had encountered in the jungle so far. It was low, guttural, and impossibly close. A growl that seemed to rumble through the air, vibrating in his chest. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The growl came again, deeper this time, reverberating through the trees. It wasn't a leopard or any other predator he could think of. It was something larger, something far more powerful. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source of the sound, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. But running would be suicide. And then he saw them. Two gorillas emerged from the shadows, their massive forms illuminated faintly by the sliver of moonlight that managed to break through the canopy above. The silverback was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, its powerful frame radiating strength. Beside it, a smaller female stood, her posture less aggressive but equally commanding. Their dark eyes locked onto Michael, unblinking and unreadable. The silverback's chest rose and fell with deep, deliberate breaths, the sound almost like a drum beat in the quiet of the jungle. Michael felt the weight of their presence like a physical force. Time seemed to stop as Michael stood frozen, his body unwilling to obey the desperate commands of his mind. He knew better than to run. Gorillas were territorial, and a silverback's charge could be deadly. But staying still wasn't much better. It left him exposed, vulnerable. His thoughts raced, scrambling for something, anything, that could defuse the situation. Slowly, deliberately, Michael began to lower himself to the ground, his knees trembling as he crouched. He avoided direct eye contact, keeping his head slightly bowed. He wasn't just showing submission, he was surrendering to their world. The silverback took a step closer, its massive hand brushing the ground as it moved. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps as he watched the gorilla's muscles ripple with every step. He could feel the tension in the air, the raw power radiating from the animal. The silverback stopped just a few feet away, close enough that Michael could hear the deep rumble of its breathing. Then, to his shock, the silverback leaned forward slightly, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Michael's heart raced, his body trembling uncontrollably. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. But instead of charging, the silverback let out a low, soft grunt. It wasn't aggressive, it almost sounded inquisitive. Michael dared to lift his eyes slightly, enough to see the female gorilla moving closer as well. Her gaze wasn't hostile, but curious, as if she were trying to understand what this strange creature was doing in their jungle. Michael remained perfectly still, his knees aching from the crouched position, his hands trembling at his sides. The silverback sniffed the air again, its dark eyes studying him intently. It seemed to be assessing him, deciding whether he was a threat or something else entirely. Minutes passed, though to Michael, they felt like hours. His legs burned from the strain, but he didn't dare move. The silverback finally straightened, letting out another grunt, this one softer than the last. To Michael's amazement, it turned and began to walk away, the female following closely behind. Michael exhaled shakily, his body trembling from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He thought it was over, that they had left him behind. But just as he began to breathe a sigh of relief, the silverback stopped and turned its head, looking back at him. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The silverback's eyes met his, and for a moment it felt as though the animal was waiting. The female stopped as well, glancing back at Michael before continuing forward. Michael hesitated, unsure of what to do. Was the silverback calling him to follow? Or was this some kind of test? He felt a strange pull, an instinct he couldn't explain, telling him to trust the impossible. Slowly, cautiously, Michael took a step forward, then another, until he was walking in the same direction as the gorillas. With every step, the jungle seemed to close in tighter, its shadows growing deeper. He wasn't just lost in the jungle anymore, he was stepping into their world. Michael moved cautiously, each step deliberate and measured. The silverback's massive frame swayed slightly ahead of him, its movement steady and purposeful. The female followed close behind her leader, occasionally glancing back at Michael, as if to ensure he was keeping up. What am I doing? The thought pounded in Michael's mind, but his body kept moving forward. He felt like an intruder, out of place in this silent procession through the jungle. Yet, at the same time, a strange sense of calm began to settle over him. The gorillas had accepted his presence, for now. The jungle, however, was far less forgiving. Vines snagged at Michael's legs, and the thick underbrush made every step a challenge. Above, the canopy loomed like a fortress, its interlocking branches sealing out almost all traces of moonlight. He stumbled once, his boot catching on a hidden root, and the sudden noise startled the female. She turned sharply, her body tensing. Michael froze, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. The silverback stopped too, casting a backward glance. For a moment, Michael's heart pounded in his throat, fearing the dynamic had shifted. But the female relaxed, and with a grunt from the silverback, they resumed their journey. After what felt like an eternity, the dense jungle began to thin. Michael noticed the air becoming cooler, less oppressive, as the trees opened up to reveal a small clearing bathed in faint moonlight. Here, the troop waited. Michael's breath hitched as his eyes adjusted to the scene before him. There were more of them. A family of gorillas, 3 females, a couple of juveniles, and even a small infant clinging to its mother's chest, sat scattered across the clearing. The silverback grunted softly, a signal, and the troop immediately shifted their attention to him. Their dark eyes studied Michael, their postures tense but not overtly aggressive. Michael remained at the edge of the clearing, his body stiff with uncertainty. He felt like a visitor in an ancient cathedral, a place not meant for him. The silverback moved to the center of the group, his sheer size dwarfing the others. He sat down slowly, his presence commanding yet calm. One by one, the other gorillas followed suit, their muscles relaxing. It was an unspoken invitation. Michael could feel it. They weren't running him off, not yet. His hands trembled as he slowly lowered himself to the ground, careful not to appear threatening. The night deepened, and Michael remained where he was, barely daring to move. The gorillas, though still aware of him, seemed to ease into their routines. A young juvenile swung playfully on a low-hanging branch, its small hands gripping the vines as it chattered softly. Two females sat grooming each other, their fingers meticulously parting tufts of fur. The silverback, however, kept one eye on Michael, his gaze calm but watchful. It was surreal. Michael had spent years studying gorillas from afar, using telephoto lenses to capture fleeting moments of their lives. Now he was here, closer than he had ever imagined, and without the barrier of a camera lens to shield him. He could hear the sound of their breaths, the rustling of their movements, even the faint crackle of their jaws as they chewed on leaves. Then something extraordinary happened. One of the juveniles, its curiosity piqued, began to inch toward Michael. Its movements were hesitant, its small, round eyes flicking between him and the silverback, as if seeking permission. Michael's pulse quickened. He kept perfectly still, his hands resting on his knees, his body open and unthreatening. The juvenile stopped just short of Michael, tilting its head as if trying to make sense of this strange being in its world. Slowly, almost hesitantly, it reached out a hand. Michael felt his breath catch as the small, leathery fingers brushed against the fabric of his pants. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a wave of emotion crashing through him. He fought the urge to move, to respond, knowing that even the slightest gesture could shatter the fragile moment. The juvenile let out a soft grunt before scampering back to its mother, who was watching closely. Michael exhaled slowly, a faint smile breaking through his nerves. It wasn't just a moment of curiosity, it was the first sign of trust. As the night wore on, Michael felt the exhaustion creeping into his body. His muscles ached from tension, and his stomach growled faintly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since morning. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. The gorillas had begun to settle down, their movements slowing as they prepared to sleep. The silverback reclined against a tree, his massive arms crossed over his chest, while the females and juveniles huddled close together in small nests of leaves. Michael stayed at the edge of the clearing, resting his back against a tree. His mind raced with questions. Why had the silverback allowed him to stay? Was it curiosity? A lack of perceived threat? Or something deeper, an unspoken recognition of vulnerability, of shared existence? Whatever it was, Michael felt something he hadn't expected. A profound sense of belonging. When the first light of dawn filtered through the canopy, Michael awoke to the sounds of the troop stirring. The silverback was the first to rise, stretching his massive arms before scanning the clearing with a protective gaze. The rest of the gorillas followed, their movements slow and unhurried. Michael watched as they began to forage, their hands deftly picking leaves and fruit from nearby plants. To his surprise, they didn't seem to mind his presence. A young female sat just a few feet away, chewing on a handful of leaves, her gaze occasionally drifting toward him. Michael's stomach tightened with hunger, but he didn't move, not wanting to disrupt the delicate balance of trust that had formed overnight. As the day progressed, Michael realized he couldn't stay forever. He had to find his way back to civilization, to safety, but leaving felt harder than he expected. The silverback, as if sensing his thoughts, approached him one last time. The massive gorilla stood just a few feet away, his dark eyes locking onto Michael's. For a moment, it felt as though they understood each other, as though something unspoken passed between them. Michael lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect, and the silverback let out a low grunt in response. Without another glance, the silverback turned and began to lead his family deeper into the jungle. Michael watched as they disappeared into the dense foliage, their forms swallowed by the greenery. Michael eventually found his way back to his camp, exhausted but profoundly changed. He would later describe the experience as the most humbling moment of his life. "They didn't have to accept me," he would say in interviews, "but they did. For one night, they let me be part of their world." Some encounters, Michael realized, are too sacred to capture on film. Instead, they stay with you, etched in your memory, as a reminder of the fragile and extraordinary bond between humans and the wild. Some experiences change us in ways we can't fully explain. For Michael, being accepted by the gorilla family wasn't just a moment of survival, it was a profound lesson in trust, connection, and the shared vulnerability of life itself. In the heart of the jungle, stripped of all the tools and comforts of modern civilization, he was no longer just a human observing the wild. He became part of it, even if just for a fleeting moment. The silverback's gaze, the gentle touch of the juvenile's hand, and the quiet acceptance of the troop reminded Michael, and all of us, that there is a bridge between us and the natural world, even when it feels like we are miles apart. The most surprising part of Michael's journey wasn't the danger or the uncertainty. It was the kindness he found in a place he least expected. The gorillas had no reason to trust him. They had every instinct to fear and reject him. But they didn't. They showed him that in the wild, as in life, compassion can exist in the most unlikely of places. That moment when the silverback looked back at Michael as if to invite him forward wasn't just an invitation to follow. It was an invitation to see the world differently. This story is more than a tale of survival. It's a reminder of the fragile connections that bind us to the creatures we share this planet with. It's a call to reflect on how we interact with the natural world, not as conquerors, but as participants. The gorillas didn't see Michael as a threat, they saw him as someone lost, someone in need. And in their quiet, unspoken way, they gave him something rare. A chance to belong, to be part of something bigger than himself. What if we all saw the world through that lens? What if, instead of fear, we chose curiosity? Instead of dominance, we chose coexistence? Michael's story reminds us that the wild isn't as far from us as we think. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of trust to close the distance. What did this story make you feel? Do you believe that humans and wildlife can truly share a connection this deep? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to join our community. Here on our channel, we bring you powerful stories of extraordinary encounters between humans and wildlife. Tales that inspire, amaze, and remind us of the beauty of our shared world. Don't miss the next adventure. Subscribe now and let's explore these incredible connections together.